At the turn of the 20th century, there was a brief, volatile moment when private wealth no longer wanted discretion. It wanted proof. Biltmore rose from that impulse, not as a house but as a declaration, an architectural statement so vast that it permanently shifted the boundary between residence and empire. More than 175,000 square feet under roof. 250 rooms. A private domain that functioned less like a home and more like a self-contained world, engineered to display power without a crown. Stand at its entrance and the scale does something unsettling. It does not invite you in. It measures you. The inspiration was European, but the ambition was distinctly American. Modeled after the great French chateaux of the Loire Valley, Biltmore borrowed their stone vocabulary, their vertical drama, their lineage of aristocratic permanence. Yet those buildings evolved over centuries, shaped by dynasties and wars. Biltmore was executed in a single generation, compressed into one man's lifetime, funded by industrial wealth that had materialized almost overnight. This was not inherited feudal power. This was capital translated into stone, steel, and systems. The message was unmistakable. Modern wealth could now rival old-world royalty, and do it faster. Step past the facade and the illusion of romance gives way to machinery. Biltmore was designed as a machine for living at scale, a logistical organism that required constant motion behind the scenes. Hidden corridors threaded through its walls. Service staircases bypassed public halls. Entire wings existed solely to keep the visible world effortless. Every grand space was mirrored by an unseen one. The dining room that seated dozens depended on pantries, cold storage rooms, and staff schedules precise to the minute. Luxury here was not softness. It was coordination. The house demanded dominance not just in size, but in control. It produced its own electricity. It filtered its own water. It maintained climate stability long before air conditioning became commonplace. This was a residence that refused dependence on the outside world, a fortress of self-sufficiency disguised as elegance. Behind the facade, Biltmore functioned as infrastructure. A house that became a machine. That machine required people. Hundreds of them. Maids, valets, cooks, gardeners, engineers, laundresses, footmen. Each role narrowly defined, each shift timed to the rhythms of a household that never slept. The public rooms were silent. The service floors never were. You can still feel it in the narrow passages, the low ceilings, the worn thresholds. Unseen hands moved constantly to maintain the illusion of ease. The cost of keeping it alive was paid daily, in labor as much as money. Biltmore's scale was not accidental excess. It was competitive architecture. In an era when wealth had few limits and fewer regulations, the size of one's residence became a proxy for dominance. Bigger meant more secure, more legitimate, more untouchable. The mansion was not merely shelter, it was evidence. Evidence that industrial power had translated successfully into social authority. Evidence that money could buy permanence. But permanence has requirements. Stone must be quarried. Timber must be transported. Skilled craftsmen must be imported and housed. Every carved ceiling and custom fireplace represented not just taste, but logistics. Trains delivered materials by the ton. Entire supply chains bent toward a single private project. This was architecture as consumption, visible on a geographic scale. The land itself was reshaped to accommodate the vision, turned into managed landscapes rather than wilderness. Control extended beyond walls, out into miles of engineered scenery. Stand in the central hall and look upward. The ceiling soars, deliberately dwarfing the human body. This was no accident of aesthetics. Architecture here was psychological. The space was designed to overwhelm, to assert hierarchy without a word spoken. Visitors did not need to be told who held power. The building itself communicated it. Beauty, but beauty with intent. Beauty as authority. And yet, even at its peak, there was tension embedded in the stone. A structure this vast carries weight beyond gravity. It demands upkeep, staffing, fuel, coordination. It creates obligations that do not disappear when fortunes fluctuate. The bill comes due every day, whether the owner is present or not. This is the unseen cost they don't show. The chandeliers do not light themselves. The floors do not polish themselves. The systems do not forgive neglect. Biltmore represented the absolute zenith of private residential ambition because it pushed beyond what a house needed to be and entered the realm of what wealth wanted to prove. It blurred the line between domestic comfort and institutional scale. It asked an unspoken question: how large can a private life become before it stops being private at all? The answer here was measured in acres, in staff rosters, in mechanical rooms larger than ordinary homes. There is awe in that ambition, and there is dread. A legacy with a price. The building stands as a monument to a moment when money moved faster than restraint, when architecture became a scoreboard. Behind the elegance lies a system that could only function under very specific economic conditions. Conditions that assumed endless resources, stable labor, and uninterrupted cash flow. Power without a crown, yes, but also power with dependencies. Walk through Biltmore today and you are not just walking through rooms. You are walking through a philosophy of wealth that believed scale itself was security. That belief shaped every corridor, every tower, every concealed door. It produced something astonishing and something fragile. A structure that reached the peak of mansion excess by refusing to acknowledge limits. By the 1890s, American wealth had learned a new language. It was not spoken quietly. It was spoken in stone, marble, and visibility. The Breakers was never meant to feel intimate. It was meant to be legible, instantly understood by anyone who crossed its threshold. This was architecture as social force, a structure calibrated to project dominance in a world where status was no longer inherited by blood alone but performed in public. Stand on the lawn and the message is immediate. This is not shelter. This is position. The house rose in Newport at a moment when society itself was becoming a stage. Old mercantile families, industrial dynasties, and financial empires collided each summer in a tightly choreographed ritual of dinners, balls, and appearances. The Breakers was built to win that ritual. Every decision, from its Italian Renaissance vocabulary to its ocean-facing terraces, served one function: to declare superiority without speaking a word. Size mattered, but so did sequence. Guests did not wander. They progressed. Arrival, reception, dining, spectacle. The house guided them through power. Step past the showpiece rooms and the intent sharpens. The ceilings rise precisely where crowds gathered. Corridors narrow where service disappeared. The building understood bodies, movement, and hierarchy. Grand staircases existed for display, not convenience. They slowed people down. They forced eye contact. They made arrival theatrical. Architecture here was not passive. It controlled behavior. It decided who was seen and who remained invisible. This was not a private residence in the modern sense. It was an instrument, a social weapon deployed during a season that lasted only weeks but determined reputations for years. Invitations mattered more than comfort. Hosting mattered more than privacy. The house needed to absorb hundreds of guests, sometimes simultaneously, without ever appearing strained. That illusion depended on an army of unseen labor operating behind the facade. Kitchens ran like factories. Staff rotated in shifts timed to the rhythm of parties that stretched late into the night. The machinery of luxury never stopped. The Breakers was designed to burn brightly, not efficiently. Imported materials crossed oceans to arrive here. Marble from Italy. Rare woods shipped and carved on site. The costs were staggering, but that was the point. In an environment where wealth was increasingly abstract, stocks, trusts, railroads, architecture made it tangible. It converted invisible capital into physical dominance. You could touch it, walk through it, be dwarfed by it. And people were meant to be dwarfed. The rooms are scaled not to human proportion, but to social impact. Conversations happen under ceilings that refuse intimacy. Dining tables stretch long enough to turn meals into performances. Every gathering became a census of power: who sat closest, who arrived earliest, who was seen speaking to whom. The house did not just host society. It organized it. Behind the spectacle lay rigid systems. Servants moved through hidden corridors and staircases designed to erase their presence. Bells summoned them silently. Schedules dictated every hour. The cost of keeping it alive extended far beyond construction. Wages, food, maintenance, constant repair. Salt air corroded metal. Fireplaces demanded fuel. Chandeliers required cleaning by hand, one crystal at a time. What they don't show is the daily expense of sustaining perfection. Yet excess itself was the currency. In the Gilded Age, restraint read as weakness. A smaller house suggested smaller reach. Rival families watched each other closely, measuring ballroom size against ballroom size, guest lists against guest lists. Architecture became a public ledger. Who spent more? Who entertained better? Who commanded attention? The Breakers was built to dominate that comparison, to ensure its owners never appeared second. Stand in the Great Hall and listen to the acoustics. They amplify voices just enough to carry, just enough to be overheard. This was intentional. Reputation traveled through sound as much as sight. A whispered alliance. A public compliment. A strategic introduction. The house made sure these moments lingered. Power here was not exercised through law or force, but through access. But power without a crown is fragile. It depends on constant reinforcement. Each season demanded renewal, fresh decoration, new spectacles. The house could not rest. If it stopped dazzling, it risked irrelevance. The bill comes due not only in money, but in momentum. Behind the facade, anxiety coexisted with grandeur. A single failed season could shift perception. A single rival event could eclipse months of planning. The Breakers reveal something darker beneath its brilliance. These mansions were never neutral achievements of taste. They were weapons in a social arms race, built to intimidate as much as impress. They concentrated resources, labor, and land into monuments that served a narrow elite while projecting inevitability. They suggested permanence even as the economic forces that funded them grew volatile. Walk its rooms today and you can still sense the pressure, the expectation, the constant performance. Beauty is everywhere, but it is disciplined, controlled, and purposeful. Nothing here is accidental. Every surface participates in a hierarchy. Every space enforces a role. The house did not simply reflect social order. It manufactured it. High above the California coast, Hearst Castle presents itself as triumph frozen in stone, but its true story begins with a question that never quite found an answer. When does ambition stop serving its owner and begin demanding obedience? From the moment construction began in 1919, the estate entered a state of permanent becoming. It was never finished. It was never satisfied. What emerged was not a home with a lifespan, but a project without an endpoint. Stand on the terraces and the view is cinematic, almost unreal, yet beneath that beauty sits an architecture straining under its own appetite. The castle grew not through restraint, but accumulation. More rooms, more ghost houses, more imported materials. Ancient columns shipped from Europe. Tile work designed, redesigned, then replaced. Each addition answered a desire but created a new obligation. Construction crews cycled endlessly through the property, year after year, while other mansions of the era reached completion and settled into routine. Hearst Castle refused that stillness. It existed in a constant state of expansion, a house that became a machine for consumption. This was extravagance pushed beyond ceremony and into logistics. Materials arrived by ship, then rail, then truck, then mule. Everything cost more because everything had to travel farther, be handled more carefully, be assembled repeatedly as plans evolved. There was no final blueprint, only revisions. What they don't show is how that fluid vision translated into invoices that never stopped arriving. The bill came due not once, but daily. Step past the showpiece rooms and the cracks begin to appear. The estate demanded a staff roster that rivaled small institutions. Housekeepers, cooks, engineers, gardeners, security, chauffeurs, technicians. Pools required constant heating and cleaning. Guest houses needed staffing even when unoccupied. Generators consumed fuel. Plumbing systems spanned multiple elevations and climates. The cost of keeping it alive did not scale linearly. It multiplied. Hearst Castle was designed to host, but hosting itself became a burden. Guests arrived expecting perfection, novelty, spectacle. That expectation forced constant upgrades. New furnishings. New artworks. New technologies. Comfort became obsolete almost as soon as it was installed. The house could not simply function. It had to astonish. And astonishment is expensive. Behind the facade, unseen hands worked to keep the illusion intact. Servants navigated hidden corridors and service tunnels designed to erase effort from sight. Maintenance crews labored quietly to repair salt damage from coastal air, leaks from experimental plumbing, electrical failures from systems never meant to run continuously at this scale. Unlike older European estates, which evolved slowly with established support structures, this was an American experiment executed at industrial speed. And experiments have failure points. The scale itself created inefficiencies. Heating vast volumes of air. Lighting rooms larger than public buildings. Cleaning surfaces designed more for impact than practicality. Every architectural flourish introduced a maintenance problem. Ornate stone required preservation. Imported woods warped in unfamiliar climates. Pools evaporated water faster than systems could replenish without intervention. Luxury here was not passive. It demanded constant negotiation. Hearst Castle quietly exposed the flaw at the heart of megamansions. They assume uninterrupted wealth. They assume the owner's resources will always outpace the building's needs. But buildings are patient. They wait. Economic conditions change. Markets fluctuate. Revenues tighten. The house remains indifferent to balance sheets. Power without a crown still answers to arithmetic. Stand in the great rooms and consider how few people ever use them simultaneously. Space outpaced purpose. Entire wings existed more as symbols than necessities. That imbalance is where overreach becomes visible. Architecture that no longer serves living, but legacy. And legacies are expensive to defend. As years passed, the estate's operational weight became impossible to ignore. Staff reductions altered rhythms. Deferred maintenance quietly accumulated. Decisions once made impulsively now required calculation. The machinery of luxury began to grind instead of glide. What once felt limitless revealed itself as fragile, dependent on constant input to avoid decline. Hearst Castle did not collapse. It did something more revealing. It slowed. Construction paused. Plans went unrealized. Ambitions outlived their feasibility. The house remained magnificent, but the illusion of infinite expansion broke. A project designed without an ending finally encountered one, not through disaster, but through exhaustion. This is the moment where excess stops being abstract and becomes measurable. Costs that cannot be justified by use. Labor that cannot be reduced without visible consequences. Infrastructure that cannot be abandoned without damage. A legacy with a price that continues long after the original vision fades. Versailles began as an assertion of absolute control, but its fate was sealed the moment scale replaced consent. What started as a hunting lodge expanded into a palace so vast it no longer served a king as much as it exposed him. By the late 17th century, Versailles was not simply a residence. It was an operating system for power, designed to centralize authority, surveil loyalty, and stage dominance daily. Stand in the Hall of Mirrors and the brilliance is undeniable, but the weight is immediate. This was not comfort. This was command architecture, and command comes with costs. The palace absorbed resources at a scale that distorted the state itself. Tens of thousands of laborers worked for decades to expand, decorate, repair, and maintain it. Entire forests were cleared for timber. Quarries ran continuously to supply stone. Water had to be forced uphill through complex pumping systems just to feed fountains that existed purely for spectacle. What they don't show is that the gardens alone required more engineering than many cities of the time. Luxury here was not ornamental. It was infrastructural. Versailles functioned as a mechanism of control, but mechanisms require energy. Nobles were compelled to live at court, draining their finances to maintain appearances while remaining under constant observation. Rooms were assigned by rank. Proximity to the king became currency. The palace dictated social oxygen. Yet this concentration of life created inefficiency at every level. Food spoiled before reaching distant apartments. Heating vast stone volumes consumed enormous fuel. Staff numbers swelled into the thousands, each role narrowly defined, each dependent on the palace continuing to function without interruption. Step past the ceremonial spaces and the imbalance becomes visible. Narrow servant corridors, overcrowded quarters, kitchens operating at near-industrial scale to serve meals that lasted hours but fed appetites shaped by hierarchy rather than hunger. The machinery of luxury strained constantly. Repairs never ended. Roofs leaked, stone cracked, gilding tarnished. The cost of keeping it alive rose faster than the kingdom's ability to pay for it. Versailles was meant to embody stability. Instead, it became a ledger of excess. Taxes increased to sustain it. Rural populations bore the burden through levies that funded marble floors they would never walk on. Over time, the palace stopped symbolizing strength and began to signify extraction. Behind the facade of grandeur, resentment accumulated quietly. The bill comes due not only in money, but in legitimacy. Architecture at this scale magnifies visibility. Every feast held during famine. Every fountain running during drought. Every renovation completed while debt mounted. The palace could not hide its appetite. It broadcast it. Power without a crown still requires belief, and Versailles slowly eroded that belief by making inequality tangible. You could see where the resources went. You could smell the kitchens. You could hear the music echo while bread prices rose. The inefficiency was not accidental. It was structural. Royal-scale living assumes permanence. It assumes that authority will remain unquestioned, that labor will remain available, that resources will continue to flow inward. Versailles depended on uninterrupted obedience. When that obedience wavered, the palace became indefensible. Its scale turned from asset to liability. Stand in the gardens and consider the manpower required just to maintain illusion. Lawns trimmed by hand. Fountains activated only when the king approached because the system could not run continuously. Entire teams repositioned constantly to preserve appearances. This was sustainability by choreography, not design. The system worked only as long as everyone played their role. As economic pressures mounted and political ideas shifted, Versailles lost its protective aura. What once inspired awe began to provoke anger. The palace remained physically intact, but its symbolic function inverted. It no longer represented order. It represented detachment. A house that became a machine, consuming without producing, demanding without reciprocating. This transformation holds the lesson. Massive estates do not merely reflect power, they amplify scrutiny. The larger the structure, the harder it is to justify. Inefficiencies that might be invisible at smaller scales become unavoidable. Operational burdens become moral questions. Who maintains this? Who pays for this? Who benefits from this? Versailles did not fall because it was ugly or poorly built. It fell out of favor because it made inequality architectural. It turned abstract imbalance into daily spectacle. Once that happened, preservation of the palace required separation from the system that created it. The building survived, but the model of living it represented could not. Walk through Versailles today and the silence is striking. The rooms remain vast, but their purpose has shifted. They no longer command obedience. They invite examination. The hidden corridors now reveal more than the grand halls ever did. The unseen hands are gone, but their absence speaks loudly. This is why royal-scale living became a liability. Not because beauty fades, but because scale exposes truth. The larger the structure, the harder it is to disguise who carries the cost. Versailles stands as a warning etched in stone and waterworks and ledgers. Grandeur without restraint does not age into legacy. It hardens into evidence. Falling water announces itself not with scale, but with intent. There is no long approach meant to intimidate, no facade designed to overwhelm. Instead, the house reveals itself gradually, almost reluctantly, as if it were part of the landscape rather than imposed upon it. Built in the mid-1930s, at a moment when the world was questioning excess, this was a radical redefinition of what architectural power could look like. Stand above the stream and listen first. Water moves beneath the structure, not around it. This was not an accident. It was a decision. The house rejects the idea that influence must be measured in square footage. At roughly 5,300 square feet, it is modest by the standards of earlier estates, yet its impact far exceeds that of many mansions 10 times its size. What falling water demonstrates is a shift in ambition. Wealth no longer needed to shout. It needed to explain itself. Architecture became less about domination and more about intelligence. Less about accumulation, more about integration. Step past the entry and the boundaries blur. Interior and exterior dissolve into one another through cantilevered terraces, low ceilings, and continuous stone floors that extend outward. The house does not elevate its occupants above nature. It inserts them into it. This was a profound reversal of earlier philosophies, where land was reshaped, leveled, and controlled to serve the building. Here the building submits. The rock outcrop remains. The stream dictates placement. Trees are not cleared for symmetry. They are negotiated with. Behind the facade, however, restraint did not mean simplicity. The engineering was daring, even risky. Reinforced concrete slabs extended outward over water, requiring calculations that pushed materials to their limits. Steel was hidden within stone. Loads were balanced with precision. This was a house that demanded constant attention to structure, not ornament. The machinery of luxury was no longer about staffing and spectacle, but about integrity. If the system failed, the house failed visibly. What they don't show at first glance is the discipline required to live here. Ceilings are intentionally low to compress space, making the terraces feel expansive by contrast. Furniture is built in. Circulation is controlled. Views are framed deliberately. The house dictates behavior quietly, asking occupants to slow down, to notice, to accept constraints. Luxury here is not excess. It is focus. This represented a broader change in how wealth wanted to be perceived. After economic collapse and global uncertainty, magnitude began to feel irresponsible. Large estates became liabilities, symbols of detachment and inefficiency. Falling water offered an alternative narrative. It suggested that intelligence, not size, could confer status. That alignment with environment could signal sophistication more effectively than acreage. Stand in the main living space and notice how sound behaves. The waterfall is present but softened, a constant reminder of movement beneath stillness. This was architecture as dialogue rather than monologue. The house speaks with its surroundings, not over them. Power without a crown takes a different form here. It is confidence without display. Yet restraint carries its own costs. The integration that makes falling water extraordinary also makes it vulnerable. Moisture infiltrates. Concrete cracks. Steel corrodes. Preservation requires expertise and constant monitoring. The cost of keeping it alive did not disappear. It changed character. Instead of armies of staff, there are engineers and conservators. Instead of spectacle, there is vigilance. The bill still comes due, just in quieter ways. This is where architectural intelligence reveals its depth. Falling water does not deny maintenance. It anticipates it. It acknowledges that living with complexity demands responsibility. Unlike megamansions that hid their burdens behind hidden corridors and unseen hands, this house exposes its systems honestly. You can see the cantilevers. You can hear the water. You understand what holds the building together. The influence of this approach was profound. Architects, patrons, and cultural leaders began to reassess what it meant to build meaningfully. Square footage lost its monopoly on prestige. Design philosophy became currency. Integration replaced isolation. A house that became a machine gave way to a house that became an argument. About balance, about place, about limits. Walk the terraces and consider how little is wasted. Every line has purpose. Every material has context. There is no room that exists solely to impress. Each space earns its existence through use and experience. This economy of intention stands in stark contrast to earlier eras, where rooms multiplied simply because they could. Falling water did not reject wealth. It redirected it. Resources were still required. Expertise was still expensive. But the expenditure was concentrated, not dispersed. Meaning replaced magnitude as the primary goal. Architecture regained its intellectual core, asking not how much can be built, but why it should be built at all. This shift did not erase moral tension. It reframed it. The question became less about who could afford size and more about who could justify intervention. Building in harmony with nature raised new responsibilities. Preservation became ethical as well as technical. The house demanded care not because it was large, but because it was precise. Stand there, suspended above moving water, and the question feels different from earlier estates. Not who paid for this, but what was paid attention to. What was respected? What was restrained? Falling water proves that influence does not require excess to endure. It requires thought. The glass house does not announce itself. It waits. Set lightly within its landscape, almost invisible at first glance, it refuses the theatrics that once defined wealth. There are no gates meant to intimidate, no towers rising to claim dominance. Instead, there is transparency, exposure, confidence stripped of armor. This was a deliberate provocation. In an era shaped by excess and spectacle, the decision to build almost nothing became the loudest statement of all. Completed in the mid-20th century, the house represents a psychological shift rather than a technical one. Power no longer needed mass to legitimize itself. It needed control. Control over taste. Over restraint. Over what was shown and what was withheld. Stand on the lawn and you are immediately aware of the risk involved. Walls dissolve. Privacy appears to vanish. And yet, that vulnerability is precisely the point. Only someone certain of their position could afford to be this exposed. Step inside and the traditional signals of luxury are gone. No corridors to disappear into. No service wings hidden behind thick masonry. No accumulation of rooms to imply hierarchy. Space is singular, uninterrupted, disciplined. The house makes no attempt to impress through scale. It impresses through refusal. Refusal to decorate. Refusal to expand. Refusal to explain itself. Behind the facade, however, minimalism is not simplicity. It is precision. Glass panels require flawless alignment. Steel frames must bear weight without ornament to distract from imperfection. Heating and cooling systems must function invisibly, maintaining comfort without compromising visual purity. The machinery of luxury is still present, but it is silent, compressed, and unforgiving. Any failure is immediately visible. There is nowhere to hide mistakes. What they don't show is the cost of restraint. Glass must be cleaned constantly. Climate control must be exact. Furnishings are curated, not abundant, and each piece carries responsibility. A single chair out of place disrupts the entire composition. Maintenance here is not about volume, but vigilance. The cost of keeping it alive shifts from labor-intensive spectacle to technical mastery. The glass house signals a new hierarchy, one based not on how much space you command, but how little you require. It suggests that ownership of land, time, and cultural literacy has replaced the need for architectural dominance. This is power without a crown expressed through subtraction. The absence of walls becomes a display of authority rather than weakness. Stand in the center of the room and notice how the landscape becomes the decoration. Seasons change the interior without permission. Light dictates mood. Privacy is achieved not through barriers, but through distance and context. The house assumes its occupant does not need protection from the world. That assumption is itself a luxury. This was a direct rejection of the megamansion logic that preceded it. No armies of staff are required to operate this space. No hidden corridors funnel unseen hands through the building. Labor is minimized, not erased. The house demands attention from its owner, not just their money. To live here is to participate actively in the architecture, to accept that comfort comes with awareness. Minimalism, in this context, becomes a status symbol because it implies freedom from accumulation. It suggests that the owner has nothing to prove and nothing to conceal. Excess begins to look anxious. Scale begins to look defensive. The glass house reframes wealth as confidence in emptiness. Yet this transparency introduces a different kind of tension. Exposure creates vulnerability. Weather, light, and sight lines become unavoidable. The building does not buffer its occupant from reality. It frames it. This is not retreat. It is engagement. And engagement requires discipline. The cost is psychological as much as financial. There is no retreat into private wings. No separation between public and personal space. The house collapses distinction. That collapse signals trust in one's social position. Only someone certain of their security can live without architectural armor. Behind the elegance lies an unspoken contract. Minimalism works only when supported by stability. It assumes resources elsewhere. It assumes land ownership sufficient to guarantee privacy through distance rather than walls. It assumes access to expertise capable of maintaining fragile systems. The absence of excess is not the absence of wealth. It is its refinement. Walk around the perimeter and the house changes constantly. Reflections replace walls. Interior and exterior exchange roles. The building resists ownership in the traditional sense. It cannot be dominated. It must be managed delicately. This inversion is key. The house does not submit to its occupant. The occupant submits to the house. This is why minimalism became aspirational. It inverted the logic of prestige. Instead of asking how much can be built, it asked how little is necessary. Instead of celebrating accumulation, it celebrated control. Taste replaced size as the primary signal of status. The glass house exposes something uncomfortable. When architecture removes spectacle, it reveals intent. There is no distraction here. No ornament to soften judgment. Every choice is visible. Every compromise is exposed. The house becomes a mirror, reflecting not just landscape, but values. This shift did not eliminate moral tension. It sharpened it. If excess was once hidden behind walls and corridors, Minimalism makes the relationship between wealth and space explicit. Who gets to live without walls? Who gets to choose exposure? Who can afford purity? Stand there as daylight fades and the glass turns reflective. The interior becomes visible from the outside. The occupant becomes part of the display. This reversal is intentional. It suggests that true confidence no longer needs to hide behind stone. It can afford transparency. The glass house marks the moment when restraint itself became a luxury good. When silence replaced spectacle. When absence spoke louder than presence. It is architecture as declaration through refusal, status achieved not by building more, but by daring to build less. Apple Park does not look like a monument to power in the traditional sense, and that is precisely why it matters. There is no grand staircase meant to humble visitors, no gilded hall announcing personal triumph. Instead, the structure curves inward, sealed, self-contained, almost anonymous from the outside. It does not ask to be admired. It asks to function. This is where architectural ambition went when private palaces stopped making sense. Power did not disappear. It relocated. For centuries, influence was expressed through personal residence. Land ownership equaled authority. Square footage equaled legitimacy. But by the early 21st century, the equation had changed. Visibility became liability. Personal exhibition invited scrutiny. The cost of keeping it alive, financial, social, reputational, outpaced the benefits. Architecture adapted. What once served individuals now served systems. Stand at the perimeter of Apple Park and the absence is striking. No name carved into stone. No private quarters to tour. No lineage on display. The building resists personalization by design. It is circular, continuous, without hierarchy of facade. Every side looks the same. That uniformity is not aesthetic minimalism alone. It is strategic. Behind the facade lies one of the most complex architectural machines ever constructed. Over 2 million square feet engineered to house tens of thousands of people. Custom glass panels, each curved and fabricated to tolerances measured in millimeters. Ventilation systems designed to eliminate the need for traditional heating and cooling most of the year. Power drawn from renewable sources at a scale once reserved for municipalities. This is not domestic luxury. This is institutional ambition. What they don't show is how carefully personal presence was removed from the equation. There are no executive apartments hidden in the upper levels. No private dining halls reserved for a single family. Space is allocated by function, not by bloodline. Status here is not spatial. It is operational. Influence is measured in decisions, not rooms. Step inside and the choreography becomes visible. Movement is controlled. Sight lines are deliberate. Collaboration spaces replace ballrooms. Cafeterias replace banquet halls. The machinery of luxury has been repurposed to produce output rather than impression. Thousands of unseen hands still keep the system running, engineers, maintenance crews, security teams, but their labor sustains productivity, not spectacle. This shift reflects a deeper truth about modern power. It no longer needs to be personal to be absolute. It no longer requires a throne room. In fact, the absence of personal exhibition strengthens authority by separating influence from indulgence. A private palace invites questions. A campus implies purpose. Apple Park functions as a legacy structure without the burden of inheritance. It does not belong to a family line. It belongs to an idea. That distinction matters. Buildings tied to individuals age poorly when fortunes change or reputations falter. Institutions absorb continuity. They outlast names. The cost, however, did not disappear. It multiplied and redistributed. Construction ran into the billions. Maintenance requires constant calibration. Landscaping must meet exacting standards across acres of curated environment. Glass panels must be cleaned and inspected. Systems must remain invisible and flawless. The bill comes due quietly, spread across budgets rather than borne by a single household. Stand in the central courtyard and notice how nature is framed, not conquered. Trees planted deliberately, not inherited. Walking paths designed for circulation, not leisure. This is not retreat. It is containment. The campus creates an inward-facing world where work replaces domestic life as the primary organizing principle. This is where architectural ambition found safety. Campuses do not provoke the same resentment as palaces because they promise utility. They claim to generate value, employment, innovation. Whether that promise is fulfilled is debated, but the architectural message is clear. Power here presents itself as productive rather than indulgent. The transition was not accidental. Tax structures changed. Public sentiment shifted. Media scrutiny intensified. A mansion could no longer hide behind gates and acreage. Every excess became symbolic. Every chandelier invited commentary. By contrast, a headquarters reframes scale as necessity. Size becomes operational, not personal. Behind the glass, hierarchy still exists, but it is abstracted. Executives occupy offices indistinguishable from one another. Prestige is conveyed through access, not space. Meetings replace meals. Influence moves through networks rather than corridors. The house that became a machine evolved into the machine that replaced the house. This is influence without personal exhibition. No bedroom to photograph. No dining room to criticize. No lineage to interrogate. The architecture absorbs attention while deflecting blame. It stands as infrastructure, not indulgence. And yet, moral tension remains. Campuses consolidate power just as estates once did. They consume land, resources, labor. They shape cities and economies. The difference is optics. What was once private now claims public benefit. What was once decorative now claims efficiency. Walk the ring and you sense the discipline. The refusal of ornament. The suppression of individuality. This is confidence expressed through control rather than display. A different kind of restraint. A different kind of excess. Apple Park marks the moment architectural ambition detached fully from domestic life. The private palace became obsolete not because wealth diminished, but because it learned where to hide. Behind systems. Behind institutions. Behind glass that reflects sky instead of self. The line begins with an audacious premise that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras of wealth. Not a house. Not an estate. Not even a campus. An entire city, conceived as a single architectural gesture. 170 kilometers long. 500 meters high. Mirror-clad, linear, sealed. This is where ambition went when mansions became irrelevant. When private excess stopped delivering permanence. When the ultra-rich stopped asking how they would live, and started asking how they would be remembered. For centuries, the logic was simple. Wealth built houses. Bigger houses meant bigger legacies. Stone equaled memory. But stone also decays. Roofs fail. Staff leave. Taxes rise. The cost of keeping it alive grows heavier with time, until the house becomes an artifact rather than a symbol. Today's wealth understands this too well. Personal architecture ages badly. It ties legacy to one body, one family, one reputation. Cities, by contrast, absorb time. They outlive founders. They forgive reinvention. Stand at the scale of the line and the shift is immediate. There is no front door. No private wing. No master bedroom overlooking controlled land. The project rejects domestic hierarchy entirely. It does not exist to shelter an individual. It exists to organize millions. This is power without a crown expressed at urban scale. Behind the facade lies a redefinition of control. Transportation compressed into minutes. Energy systems designed to be closed-loop. Water desalinated, recycled, rationed by algorithm. artificial intelligence managing climate, logistics, movement. The machinery of luxury has expanded beyond households into governance itself. This is not about comfort. It is about systems. What they don't show in early renderings is the burdens such systems carry. Cities demand constant input, labor at scale, materials sourced globally, maintenance that never pauses. The bill comes due not once, but every day, in energy, staffing, surveillance, and political will. A city does not sleep. It consumes. Yet this is precisely why wealth moved here. A mansion asks to be judged morally. A city asks to be evaluated functionally. The optics change. Excess reframes itself as innovation. Scale becomes necessity. Control becomes efficiency. The narrative shifts from indulgence to contribution. Earlier elites tried to immortalize themselves through private beauty. Palaces, estates, retreats hidden behind land and walls. But history exposed the flaw. Those structures aged into symbols of imbalance. They made inequality architectural. Cities do the opposite. They claim to solve problems. Housing, density, sustainability. Whether they succeed is secondary to the ambition itself. The line promises zero cars, zero emissions, maximum density without sprawl. These promises matter less than what they signal. Wealth now wants to be seen as world-shaping rather than world-consuming. It wants to fund solutions large enough to eclipse scrutiny. A mansion invites questions. A city demands deference. Step back and consider the psychology. To fund a city is to move beyond personal legacy into abstract immortality. No portrait gallery. No family crest. The name attaches to an idea instead of a room. If the idea survives, the name survives. If it fails, responsibility diffuses. Behind this shift is a quiet admission. Private architecture no longer guarantees relevance. It is too easy to critique, too easy to photograph, too easy to abandon. Urban vision, by contrast, locks capital into complexity. Once built, it cannot be easily dismantled or ignored. It forces engagement, but complexity breeds dependence. Cities require governance. Governance requires legitimacy. The unseen hands multiply: planners, engineers, security forces, administrators. Control moves from servants to systems. The relationship between wealth and labor becomes less visible, not less real. Stand in contrast to earlier eras where staff moved through hidden corridors to preserve illusion. Here, the corridors are data pipelines. The invisibility is digital. The cost of keeping it alive is buried in infrastructure budgets rather than payroll ledgers. This does not eliminate moral tension. It relocates it. The line is not an isolated case. It represents a broader pattern. Wealth no longer seeks isolation. It seeks authorship. To design a city is to design behavior, movement, consumption, interaction. This is architectural power at its most abstract and its most ambitious. Where a mansion controlled who entered, a city controls how people live. That scale of influence outlasts any individual lifespan. It creates dependency. It generates loyalty or resentment over generations. This is why today's wealth accepts the risk. The reward is permanence beyond ownership. And yet, the same question echoes through every iteration of excess. Sustainability is promised. Equity is implied. Efficiency is showcased. But cities, like palaces, reveal their truth over time. Maintenance exposes priorities. Access exposes hierarchy. Who benefits first? Who bears the cost? Walk the concept of the line and the ambition feels limitless. But ambition always feels that way at the beginning. History teaches that scale magnifies consequence. When projects grow beyond human measure, they stop responding to individuals and start responding to systems. Systems do not care about intention. They care about input. This is the final evolution of architectural ambition. From private rooms to public corridors. From houses that became machines to machines that become cities. From personal legacy to ideological footprint. The ultra-rich no longer want a mansion remembered. They want an idea remembered. An idea large enough to survive critique, collapse, and reinvention. An idea that reshapes geography instead of occupying it. And as mirrored walls stretch toward the horizon, reflecting sky instead of self, one question remains unresolved, suspended between vision and reality. When wealth builds cities to escape judgment, what does architecture truly preserve? And which structure should we investigate next?